June 16, 1945. The jungle heat in the central Philippines did not simply sit on the skin but pressed heavy and relentless until even breathing felt like labor. The air shimmered above the ground as if the war itself had lit the forest on fire. And in the middle of a clearing carved out by weeks of fighting, more than 100 Japanese women stood packed together in a tight, silent cluster. Most kept their heads bowed, while some held onto each other just to stay upright. A few stared blankly ahead, not because they were brave, but because terror had pushed them past the point of reacting at all. Sweat ran down their necks, soaking the collars of uniforms and civilian blouses that no longer resembled anything clean. Mud clung to their sandals, and insects crawled freely across ankles and arms, ignored because fear overwhelmed every other sensation. In that mass of exhaustion and dread stood Ishikawa Harumi, 23 years old, once a medical assistant attached to a Japanese infantry regiment. 5 days earlier, she'd been wrapping bandages around shattered legs and broken ribs, but now her hands trembled so violently she had to hold them behind her back so the American soldiers wouldn't see. She did not dare lift her head nor look at the line of American rifles aimed loosely in her direction. She didn't dare imagine a future beyond the next few minutes. Every story she had heard throughout training, throughout the marches, and throughout her time on the battlefield played again in her mind. Americans don't take Japanese prisoners. They shoot immediately. If you're captured, it's better to die before they touch you. Harumi didn't know whether any of it was true, but the fear felt true, and sometimes fear was stronger than facts. The American patrol emerged fully from the tree line, with helmets low barrels steady and boots sinking slightly into the humid earth. They moved with a confidence that made Harumi's stomach twist, for these were men who had fought their way across islands for 3 years. One soldier separated himself from the formation. He was a tall, dust-covered sergeant who carried his weapon with a kind of tired familiarity that suggested he had seen too much but kept going anyway. Sweat slid down the side of his jaw, leaving streaks through the dirt on his face. His name, though, Harumi would only learn it weeks later, was Sergeant Daniel Mercer. He did not raise his rifle nor shout orders, but simply looked at them. He looked not with hatred or rage, but with something that resembled confusion and a quiet disbelief at the sight of 100 women who looked more like earthquake survivors than enemy combatants. Harumi's throat tightened, knowing that if he lifted the rifle even a little, the rest would fire. If he gave a single signal, this clearing would become their grave. Seconds stretched and her heartbeat pounded like distant artillery as she tried to brace herself not for pain, but for the instant nothingness she expected to come. But instead of a gunshot, she heard something else. A thud followed by another. 2 American soldiers stepped forward carrying heavy metal containers that were tall, insulated, and dented from travel. They set them on the ground between the 2 groups. Harumi blinked. No one in the Japanese cluster understood what they were seeing, so no one moved. One American flipped the metal latch and a hiss escaped as the lid lifted. Then a wave of hot steam rolled upward, drifting toward the women in a soft, warm cloud. It didn't smell like gunpowder or gasoline, but smelled warm, savory, and strange. It was something like cooked meat mixed with soft bread. Harumi's breath caught, not because she recognized the scent as she didn't, but because she had never expected to smell food again before dying. Sergeant Mercer stepped slightly closer, reaching into the container to pull out a wrapped bundle, which he held in his hand for a moment, as if weighing something far heavier than its actual mass. Then, he walked toward the group and toward her. The women around Harumi stiffened as some whimpered and a few closed their eyes. Mercer stopped an arm's length away, lowered his gaze to her trembling hands, and extended the wrapped bundle. His voice was steady, low, and almost gentle as he spoke. "Here," he said. "Eat. It's food." Harumi didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time since the war reached her island, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't expected to feel again. It was not hope, just disbelief. 5 days earlier, Harumi could still hear the artillery. The Japanese defensive line, already stretched thin, starving and battered by weeks of bombardment, had begun to collapse. Rumors traveled faster than orders, with commanding officers, missing supply wagons destroyed, and communication lines cut. Units that once held firm under banners and shouted commands now scattered through the jungle like frightened ghosts. Harumi had stayed behind at a makeshift medical post, treating the wounded with whatever was left, using strips of cloth torn from uniforms, boiled water, darkened with ash, and what little antiseptic remained hidden in a crate they were supposed to ration until the end of the month. She remembered the sound of soldiers breathing in pain, the smell of blood soaked into bamboo mats, and the tremor in her own hands as she tried to knot one last bandage around a shattered leg. Then the order came. Retreat. Evacuate. Move inland. Except no officer stayed long enough to guide them. The men left first, then the non-combatants, and finally the few civilians who had followed the regiment for months. By the time Harumi stepped outside the collapsing shack, half the camp had vanished into the trees. She joined a group of women moving north, including some medical assistants like her, some cooks, some clerical assistants, and a few simply wives or daughters who had been swept along when the regiment relocated. They carried almost nothing, and the small bags on their shoulders held more fear than supplies. For the first 24 hours, they walked in silence, stopping only to sip the last droplets of water from rusted canteens. On the second day, the heat became unbearable as Harumi's shoes tore and someone lost consciousness. Another woman whispered that she saw American scouts moving on the ridges nearby. The rumors returned, the same ones Harumi had heard 100 times during briefings. Americans torture prisoners. They laugh while doing it. If you surrender, you will never see another sunrise. The irony was cruel, because they were starving and exhausted, but what scared them most wasn't the jungle or the hunger. It was the idea of falling alive into American hands. On the third day, the last Japanese officer in their group, barely more than a teenager with a torn sleeve, gave a single command before disappearing into the brush. If they capture you, stay silent and be ready. Be ready meant one thing Harumi knew and everyone knew. By the fourth day, the group dwindled as some collapsed from dehydration and others wandered off delirious. The sound of fighting in the distance told them that the front had completely folded and there was nowhere left to run. By the fifth morning, Harumi could no longer feel her legs, and she leaned on another woman, an older cook named Yamada, just to keep walking. They hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the jungle air felt thick enough to choke. And then they heard boots. American boots. At first they froze, then some of the women screamed while others dropped to their knees. Harumi couldn't move, and her body locked in place as shadowed figures emerged from the greenery rifles, low but ready. She thought the moment had come, and that this was where her life ended. But instead of gunfire, shouting, or punishment, she saw Sergeant Mercer lower his weapon. She saw his men do the same, and she saw confusion, not hatred, in their eyes. And now, 5 days later, Harumi stood in front of him again, staring at the wrapped bundle he held out to her, unable to understand why the men she had feared for so long had not acted like monsters at all. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had been on patrol since sunrise, and by early afternoon, sweat had soaked through the back of his uniform. The Philippine jungle had its own way of draining a soldier slowly and relentlessly, until even the strongest man moved like he was carrying an extra pack on his shoulders. Mercer had been fighting in the Pacific since May 43, long enough to know what fear looked like, and long enough to know when something didn't add up. From the moment he spotted the group of women through the foliage, he sensed there was no ambush waiting for them here. There was no sudden rifle shot nor grenades hidden in the brush, but just raw, overwhelming exhaustion rolling off the group in waves. Still, he couldn't take chances, not after New Georgia, and not after the ambush outside Buna, where 3 men from his platoon had been killed by civilians who turned out to be disguised soldiers. The memory stayed with him like a scar he couldn't wash away. His men fanned out automatically when the women came into view, with rifles rose and eyes narrowed, so even the air felt tense. But the tension didn't last long for Mercer, not after he saw the way one woman who was thin, pale, and trembling tried to step backward and nearly fell. It was Harumi, though her name meant nothing to him then. What struck Mercer wasn't her fear, because fear was normal in war. What struck him was how complete her terror was. It was the terror of someone who believed she was about to be wiped out without a word, and the terror of someone who expected monsters, not men. He had seen hardened soldiers tremble like that only when they believed death was seconds away. So why were these women looking at him as if he were an executioner? Mercer raised a hand. "Easy," he murmured, though he knew they couldn't understand. "Lower rifles." His squad hesitated because rules said stay alert and experience said stay alive, but something in his voice, or perhaps something in the sight before them, made the men obey. When the rifles dipped, a shift rippled through the clearing. It was not relief just yet, but confusion and a tiny crack in the wall of a hopelessness. Mercer stepped forward, slow and careful. The women stiffened like a flock of birds sensing danger, but he kept his posture open with his weapon down and palms visible. The gesture wasn't in any manual, but it was something he had learned from watching locals, because hands open meant no threat. But the women didn't understand that either. One woman whimpered and another covered her face with both hands. Mercer felt something twist inside his chest, for he had seen enough battlefields to know real fear. This wasn't the fear of being captured, but the fear of being erased. Jesus. One of his privates muttered. What did they tell these people about us? Mercer didn't answer, as he didn't need to, because the answer was written across every trembling shoulder in front of him. When the food containers arrived heavy and steaming, he saw the women recoil, as if expecting acid or explosives. Something inside Mercer hardened, because if war had come to this, and if the enemy was so broken by propaganda that they feared even a meal, then there had to be a different way to diffuse this moment. He reached into the container and picked up a wrapped parcel. It was warm, smelling of beef and bread, just a hamburger like the kind he used to eat back home in Missouri during summer fairs. He walked forward. The young woman at the front, named Harumi, stood frozen with tears pooling in the corners of her eyes, looking like a deer trapped between two worlds, where one urged her to run and the other accepted fate. Mercer extended the parcel. "And that's its food," he said softly, with no shouting and no orders, just an offering. Her eyes widened, not with understanding but with disbelief. And in that brief stillness, Mercer realized something startling. These women weren't a threat, nor were they soldiers. They weren't even prisoners yet. They were frightened human beings who had no idea what mercy looked like. Harumi didn't take the wrapped parcel at first. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought her legs might give out beneath her. She had expected the sergeant to grab her, shove her to the ground, or strike her, doing anything that would fit the dark picture she had been taught to believe. But he did none of that. The American simply held the food out steady and patient, as though offering something sacred. Harumi looked around, seeing some women drop to their knees while others clung to each other, but every pair of eyes fixed on Mercer's outstretched hand. Her heart hammered so loudly she could barely think, wondering if the food was poisoned, or if it was a test, or if this was the final humiliation before death. But her body betrayed her. The smell, warm, rich, and unfamiliar, slipped into her empty stomach like a hook. She had not eaten a real meal in nearly 3 days, so hunger had carved her insides hollow. And for a moment, all the fears, warnings, and rumors tangled together into a single desperate thought that if she didn't eat now, she might not last another day. Harumi lifted her hand slowly, as if expecting pain the moment her fingers touched the paper. When her fingertips brushed the warm wrapper, she flinched, then froze when Mercer didn't move. She took the parcel, and the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Harumi stared at the thing in her hands, seeing the paper was warm and slightly greasy. Her fingers trembled as she peeled it back, revealing a round piece of bread, a slab of cooked meat, and a smell she couldn't place. She looked up, frightened, searching Mercer's face. He nodded, once calm and almost encouraging. Harumi lifted the food to her mouth and bit down. Soft bread, warm juice from the meat salt fat, and flavor so deep she felt it reach behind her ribs. The shock nearly made her drop it. A sound escaped her, part gasp and part sob, because for the first time in days, her body felt alive. Around her, other women slowly unwrapped their parcels. Some stared at the food for long seconds before daring to taste it, while others pressed trembling fingers to their lips as if they had forgotten how to eat. Then, one by one, they bit down, and the clearing filled with a strange, quiet chorus of small, stunned breaths. Then came the bottles. Dark glass, cold to the touch, with a strange metal cap on top. Harumi had never seen anything like it. She tried twisting the cap, then prying it with her nails, but nothing happened. A soldier stepped forward, careful not to startle her, took a similar bottle, placed a metal tool against the cap, and flicked it upward. The sharp hiss and pop made several women jump. He handed the bottle back with a nod, and Harumi lifted it to her lips. The moment the liquid touched her tongue, she jerked back, eyes wide. The fizz, the sweetness, and the cold raced through her mouth like electricity. She had never tasted anything like it. Some women coughed, some cried, and some clutched the bottles to their chests like precious treasures. And through all of it, through every hesitant bite, every shocked gasp, and every trembling sip, Harumi kept glancing at Mercer. He wasn't laughing, nor was he mocking them. He wasn't treating them like animals or trophies. He was watching quietly, making sure no one choked, making sure no one collapsed, and making sure the moment stayed calm. For Harumi, the world felt as if it had tilted sideways. Nothing about this matched the stories she had grown up hearing, nor did it match war or make sense. Two worlds and two realities had collided in that clearing. And for the first time, Harumi wondered if the enemy she had feared her entire life might not be the monster she had been told to expect. The sun dipped behind the jungle ridge as the clearing finally settled into an uneasy quiet. The American patrol had radioed for transport, and until trucks arrived, the women were gathered beneath a line of trees where the ground was flat enough to sit. No one dared speak above a whisper. Most clutched blankets the soldiers had handed out, which were thin olive-drab squares with rough stitching at the edges, but to the women they felt impossibly soft. Harumi pulled her blanket tight around her shoulders. The warmth from the hamburger still lingered in her stomach, with its unfamiliar weight both comforting and confusing. She kept replaying the moment, seeing the sergeant lowering his rifle, the food container opening, the steam rising, and the quiet patience in his eyes. None of it matched her understanding of war. She glanced toward the Americans who had formed a loose perimeter around the clearing. Some sat on their packs while others cleaned their weapons. A few shared cigarettes with their smoke curling upward in slow drifting trails. Their voices carried through the air, low, tired, and ordinary. They were not angry, nor cruel, but simply human. Sergeant Mercer stood off to the side, leaning against a tree as he scanned the area. His posture was relaxed, but alert, the posture of a man who had spent too many nights in uncertain territory. Every so often, his gaze drifted to the group of women, not harshly or suspiciously, but with the awareness of someone responsible for lives suddenly placed into his care. Harumi didn't know why she kept watching him, but she only knew that when she did, a small knot of fear loosened inside her. Nearby, two elderly women whispered to each other, and Harumi overheard fragments. "Do you think this is real?" one asked. "They fed us. Why feed us if they plan to kill us?" "Maybe it is a trick," the other replied. "Maybe we don't know anything anymore." Those words struck Harumi deeply, because the idea that they didn't know anything anymore summed up everything she felt. As dusk became darkness, American soldiers distributed water using metal canteens that were cold and dented, but filled with clean liquid that tasted like life itself. The women passed them carefully between one another until each had a sip. And then the moment happened. A sharp and terrified cry cut across the clearing. A young woman had tried to stand and nearly collapsed, so two soldiers rushed toward her. The rest of the women shrank back instinctively, ducking as if expecting blows, but the Americans didn't shout, nor did they strike. They knelt beside her, eased her onto a blanket, checked her pulse, and called for a medic. The medic arrived in seconds with a calm voice and careful hands. He shone a light gently against her eyelids and placed a small packet of sugar tablets into her palm. Harumi watched with a kind of stunned disbelief. She had spent months treating the wounded with rags and bamboo splints, seeing officers bark at bleeding men for showing weakness, and seeing soldiers die for lack of supplies her unit would never receive. But here, a random frightened woman received more care in 30 seconds than Harumi had seen in weeks. When the medic finished, he straightened and spoke to Mercer, saying she was dehydrated and needed to be on the first truck. Mercer nodded, then glanced toward the rest of the group. His eyes passed over Harumi for the briefest moment, and something in that glance, something steady and unspoken, made her spine tingle. It was not fear nor dread, but something closer to recognition, as if he was beginning to understand what these women had lived through. As night deepened, the perimeter, lanterns flickered on, casting soft halos of light across the clearing. The women curled beneath their blankets, where some cried quietly and some stared upward, unable to sleep. Harumi lay on her side with eyes half closed, listening to the muted rhythm of American boots moving across dirt. For the first time since the fall of their regiment, she felt not safe, but not doomed. It was a strange feeling, fragile as thin paper, but it was real. and Harumi held onto it as darkness wrapped around the camp like a closing hand. The trucks arrived just after midnight with their engines rumbling through the jungle like distant thunder. Headlights cut through the darkness in sharp white beams illuminating dust and drifting insects as the vehicles rolled into the clearing. The sound made many of the women flinch, so some covered their ears while others clutched each other in fear. To them, trucks meant relocation, and in wartime, relocation rarely brought mercy. Harumi stood with the others as American soldiers formed lines to guide them toward the cargo beds. She felt her heartbeat rise again, with fear creeping back like a shadow reclaiming its ground. The blanket around her shoulders suddenly felt thin and meaningless against the unknown waiting ahead. When her line moved forward, Harumi climbed the small metal step into the truck bed where the surface was cold beneath her hands. She settled among the women pressed shoulder to shoulder as the soldiers moved efficiently to secure the area. Sergeant Mercer approached from the side, checking names against the rough roster his men had assembled. When he reached Harumi, he paused not long but noticeably. His eyes flicked briefly to the empty hamburger wrapper still tucked inside her sleeve. He said nothing, but just nodded. And oddly, the nod steadied her. The truck jolted hard as it started moving, making the women gasp and grasp at railings or each other for balance. Harumi grabbed the wooden slat beside her with fingers tightening as the vehicle lurched over uneven ground. The jungle passed in dark, indistinct blurs while leaves slapped against the sides and the smell of diesel filled the air. For the first few minutes, no one spoke until someone whispered, asking if this was the end. Another woman murmured, asking why they would wait or give food if they wanted to kill them. The logic didn't ease their fear, but it planted a seed of uncertainty. Harumi closed her eyes and replayed Mercer's voice, remembering the soft tone he had used and the patience in his expression. She wondered if that was the face of a man preparing executions, and the question unsettled her. The truck eventually slowed and turned. Ahead, lanterns glowed in organized rows, and as they neared the outlines, sharpened into tents, supply stacks, wooden tables, and ropes marking pathways. It was an entire temporary field camp that was clean ordered and purposeful. The truck stopped and American soldiers helped the women down one by one. Some were so weak they needed 2 men to steady them, while a few collapsed the moment their feet touched the ground. Medics swooped in almost immediately, guiding the weakest toward a separate tent marked with a red cross. Harumi inhaled, slowly noticing this place smelled different, less like jungle rot and more like soap canvas and fuel. She couldn't place the feeling the atmosphere gave her, which was not comfort or safety, but structure, order, and predictability. These were things she had not known for months. She followed the line toward a long table where interpreters waited with clipboards. As she stepped forward, one interpreter, who was an older Nisei man in American uniform, looked at her gently. "Name?" he asked. Harumi hesitated, then whispered, "Ishikawa Harumi." He wrote it down carefully, repeating, "Harumi." "Okay." She blinked, realizing he didn't shout, accuse her, or even frown. Behind the table, medics checked each woman for injuries, examining hands, pulses, and eyes while speaking calmly and using real supplies like gauze disinfectant and metal instruments wrapped in cloth. Harumi felt a medic lift her wrist lightly and tell her she was dehydrated, even though she couldn't understand. But his tone told her enough. He handed her a small cup of water, and she drank it in 3 trembling gulps. As the women were guided toward their assigned tent, Harumi glanced over her shoulder. Sergeant Mercer stood near the entrance of the camp conferring with another officer, but his eyes drifted toward the procession of women and toward her for just a moment. He looked at them not as enemies nor as burdens, but as human beings thrust into a war none of them had chosen. Harumi tightened her blanket and followed the others. The terror of capture had not fully faded, but for the first time she stepped into a place that felt like it might allow her to survive the night. The first night in the field camp passed slowly, as every sound from the creak of a tent pole to the soft hum of generators and the clatter of distant boots sent ripples of tension through the women. Harumi barely slept, because each time she closed her eyes, the fear returned, wondering if morning would bring punishment or if the food was only a distraction. But morning did come, and with it came a pattern she had not expected. At dawn, guards walked past the tents calling for roll. Their voices were firm but not hostile. The women, still weary, lined up outside, and Harumi noticed something peculiar, which was that the Americans didn't rush them, nor did they bark orders. They simply waited until every woman stood in place. Breakfast followed, which was not scraps nor leftovers, but a full field meal of oatmeal bread and a spoonful of scrambled eggs that tasted powdered but warm. Harumi sat cross-legged with the others, bowl in hand, stunned by the regularity of it. A woman beside her whispered, asking why they fed them again and why they would do that. Harumi didn't know. After breakfast, medics performed health checks. Harumi braced herself when one approached expecting roughness or humiliation, but instead, he touched her wrist, gently checked her hydration, and used an interpreter to ask if she had dizziness or pain. She didn't answer, but her silence didn't anger him as he simply nodded and wrote something down. Across the camp, Harumi saw Sergeant Mercer speaking with another squad. His stance was relaxed but purposeful, like a man used to carrying responsibility. When he finished, he glanced briefly toward the women's section, just enough for Harumi to notice. She didn't know why that soothed her. Later that afternoon, the women were led to a shaded area where folding tables had been set up. Lunch consisted of stew rice and canned fruit served in metal trays. The food wasn't extraordinary, but the consistency stunned them because they had received 3 meals in less than 20 hours. Many had gone longer without food during their own army's retreat. As Harumi ate, the women whispered among themselves, saying Americans were strange, acting by rules, and wondering if they would keep them alive. Harumi didn't answer, but a tiny part of her, which was quiet and fragile, wondered the same. In the evening, guards gave them soap and instructed them to use the designated washing area. The water was cold, but it was the cleanest water Harumi had touched in weeks. When she washed her face, dirt streaked down her sleeves, and she felt almost embarrassed by how grateful she was. Night fell with surprising calm as camp lights glowed softly. The steady routine of roll call meals and checks wrapped around the women like a thin layer of order over chaos. For the first time since her capture, Harumi realized something profound. The Americans didn't treat them kindly, but they treated them consistently. And in a world where everything had collapsed, consistency was its own kind of mercy. She lay down on the thin mattress inside the tent, staring up at the canvas roof. Each breath felt steadier, and each beat of her heart less frantic. She still feared the unknown, and feared what came next, but tonight she believed just slightly that survival was possible. By the 4th day in the field camp, a strange quietness had settled over the women's section. It was not peace just yet, but a rhythm of breakfast, roll call, health checks, and simple chores. The Americans ran everything by schedule like a machine that never tired. Harumi found herself watching for Mercer without realizing it. He didn't come near them often, only to inspect give orders or escort medics, but whenever he appeared, the tension among the women eased just slightly. His presence carried a steadiness they instinctively trusted, even if they didn't understand why. That morning, rumors drifted through the camp suggesting the kitchen was preparing something different, or a special meal maybe for the soldiers, and not for them. The women didn't think much of it until lunchtime. As they stepped into the mess area, a smell rolled through the air, warm, smoky, and unmistakable. Harumi stopped mid-step, and her breath hitched while others froze beside her. On the serving line, stacked neatly in metal trays, were small sandwiches, with browned meat patties and soft bread known as hamburgers. They were not as large as the first ones, nor wrapped in paper or steaming from insulated carriers, but they had the same shape, the same smell, and the same strange promise. Harumi moved forward slowly, tray in hand. When a cook placed a hamburger onto it, she stared at the food as if it were some kind of apparition. The last time she had eaten one, she had believed she might die within hours. Now she wasn't sure what to believe. The women sat together, each holding the small sandwich with hesitant fingers. Some looked around nervously, but there was no trick, no soldiers watching them with amusement, and no test. It was just another meal in a long line of meals. Harumi took a bite. The taste wasn't identical, as it was less juicy and more seasoned, but the sensation was the same. It was a sudden warmth spreading through her stomach, a reminder of an earlier moment when terror collided unexpectedly with mercy. The women around her ate quietly, but something in their posture had changed. Shoulders lowered, breathing eased, and a few exchanged faint, fleeting smiles that were tiny, almost invisible, but real. Harumi lifted her head and froze. Sergeant Mercer stood near the edge of the mess area speaking with another officer. When he finished, he glanced toward the women's tables, and his eyes met Harumi's for the briefest moment. It was not intentional or meaningful, but just a passing acknowledgement. But that moment struck her harder than she expected, because she realized something. The first hamburger had been survival, but this hamburger was something else. It was not comfort nor gratitude, but recognition, and the understanding that she was no longer seconds from death. It meant she was living inside a system, not a nightmare, and that she could breathe without waiting for the end. When the meal ended, Harumi touched the edges of the breadcrumbs left on her tray, tracing them lightly with her fingertip. It wasn't the food that moved her, but what the food meant. It was a reminder that the enemy she feared most had given her something she never expected in war. It was not kindness nor friendship, but a chance to exist in tomorrow. She stood following the others back toward the tents, and for the first time, she stepped forward without fear slowing her feet. By the end of the first week, the field camp no longer felt like a place of immediate danger. It wasn't safety in the comforting sense, but it had become something Harumi could understand as a machine of routine schedules, rules, and predictable motions. Predictability was a strange gift for women who had spent months living hour to hour, never knowing where the next shell would fall or when the next order to retreat would arrive. Every morning began the same way, with roll call under the rising sun, followed by breakfast, served from steaming metal vats, and medical checks conducted with the same calm rhythm. The American guards still looked imposing and still carried weapons while pacing with a soldier's vigilance, but the women now recognized the difference between vigilance and aggression. The guards didn't shout, nor strike or shove, but simply enforced order. Harumi noticed the details that made the camp feel different from anything she had known in her army's retreat, such as clean canvas organized tool racks, tents arranged in straight, precise rows, and supplies stored in careful stacks where everything was labeled and maintained. War, in her experience, had been chaos, but here, even captivity had structure, and structure calmed fears. During chore assignments, Harumi worked beside women of all ages, including former menders, cooks, clerks, and daughters pulled into the war by circumstance rather than choice. They swept dust from walkways, washed mess trays, and folded blankets. The tasks were simple, but the rhythm allowed their minds to settle. One afternoon, while Harumi scrubbed a basin, a small group of American civilians approached the fence carrying crates as volunteers. They didn't speak to the prisoners, but their presence struck her deeply because these were ordinary families moving through life, even with war raging only miles away. A little boy riding on a wagon seat stared at the women with wide, curious eyes. His mother gently placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something Harumi couldn't hear, but the boy waved anyway. Harumi froze. She hadn't seen a child in over a year. The tiny, innocent, and unfiltered gesture shook something loose inside her, like a crack in the wall she had built around her emotions. She stepped back from the basin with breath unsteady. Later that day, she found herself watching Mercer from a distance. He was speaking with a lieutenant near the motor pool, with hands resting on his belt, and posture relaxed in the way seasoned NCOs carried themselves. He didn't notice her, but she watched anyway, curious and uncertain, trying to understand a man who undermined everything she'd been trained to believe. She remembered the way he lowered his rifle, the way he offered food, and the way he nodded at her in the truck. There was no malice nor cruelty, but just quiet, persistent humanity. That evening, as the women returned to their tent after supper, Harumi felt something unfamiliar settle inside her, which was a sense of future. It was not hope, but the simple awareness that tomorrow existed and would look very much like today, with regular meals order and routine. She lay on her thin mattress with her hands folded over her chest and eyes drifting shut as the generator hummed outside. For the first time since her capture, she understood she was not waiting to die, but she was learning to live inside the boundaries of a world she had never imagined. Transfer day began before sunrise. Engines rumbled in the darkness as trucks lined up outside the field camp. The women, who were still groggy and unsure, were guided into formation. A soldier calmly explained through an interpreter that they were being moved to a larger permanent holding site, which was more structured, better equipped, and longer term. The words "longer term" sent a ripple through the group, not of fear exactly, but of weight, because permanence meant this was no temporary pause before execution or release. They were entering a new chapter of captivity. Harumi climbed into a truck bed again, finding the wood familiar beneath her palms. The ride lasted hours as the jungle gave way to rough roads and open plains. Occasionally, American jeeps passed them with soldiers inside, raising hands in casual greetings, not toward them specifically, but as part of the strange normalcy of military life. When the convoy finally stopped, Harumi stared. The permanent facility looked nothing like the field camp. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the ground like a small town, and fences marked the perimeter, not with menace, but with clear boundaries. A medical building stood taller than the rest, with its white cross visible even from the trucks. Guards moved in calm patterns with steady steps and practiced routines. The women were escorted toward their assigned barracks. Inside were metal frame beds with thin but clean mattresses where blankets were folded with crisp corners and footlockers were arranged in tidy rows. Harumi touched the frame of her bed, finding it cool, solid, and real. She had slept on dirt bamboo mats and soaked canvas, so a bed felt like a luxury she didn't know how to accept. Before they could rest, the women were guided to the mess hall where the building echoed with the clang of trays and the murmur of soldiers eating their own lunches. The women received stew bread and fruit, which was not a feast but a full meal that was organized, measured, and expected. Harumi watched soldiers at nearby tables eating quickly and talking in low voices, with some laughing quietly at jokes she couldn't understand. For the first time, she saw American soldiers not as images painted by propaganda, but as men who were tired, hungry, and ordinary. After lunch, the women attended an orientation session where a Nisei interpreter explained the camp rules, work assignments, wake-up procedures, medical rights restrictions, and schedules. The rules were clear, and the punishment for breaking them was also clear, but none of it involved violence. It was a system, not a threat. Harumi sat with her hands folded, absorbing every word. The idea that she now lived in a place with rules rather than rumors brought a strange stability. She did not like captivity, but she understood it and could navigate it. As they returned to the barracks, Harumi looked across the yard and froze. It was Mercer. He stood near a supply truck with a clipboard in hand, speaking with another NCO. He wasn't looking her way, nor did he even know she was watching, but the sight of him, familiar, steady, and unchanged, pulled something tight inside her chest, because he represented the moment everything shifted. From the first lowered rifle to the first offered meal and the first sign that survival was possible. And now he was here again at the next stage of her imprisonment, like a thread quietly stitching the fractured pieces of her world together. Harumi exhaled slowly. She didn't understand this man, nor this place or her future, but she understood one truth. She was alive, and tomorrow, whatever it held, would come. Life inside the permanent facility quickly settled into a rhythm more structured than anything Harumi had experienced in months. After orientation, the women were divided into small groups for work assignments. It was nothing harsh or grueling, as tasks were based on their physical condition, such as cleaning sorting supplies, simple repairs, washing uniforms, or assisting with gardening plots near the fence line. Harumi was assigned to textile repair, where she mended torn blankets, stitched damaged uniforms, and reinforced seams. She worked alongside older women whose hands moved with calm precision, and the rhythmic pull of thread through fabric soothed her mind. It reminded her of evenings before the war when she and her sister repaired household garments under the glow of an oil lamp. The work wasn't freedom, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was routine, and routine made the days pass gently, almost quietly. During outdoor shifts, Harumi sometimes saw American civilians passing along nearby roads, including farmers transporting vegetables, families in trucks, and children waving without understanding who the women were. Each glimpse of normal life outside the fence struck her with strange intensity, as it felt like seeing a world she once belonged to but could no longer reach. One afternoon, while harvesting vegetables in the camp's small garden plots, Harumi noticed something unusual, which was a wooden crate filled with bottles packed in ice. Coca-Cola. It had been distributed before during field lunches, but this time the bottles seemed colder and the glass frosted. When a guard allowed each worker to take one, Harumi hesitated. The women around her gasped softly at the coldness while brushing frost with their fingertips. She watched as some braced themselves for the first sip, anticipating the familiar sting of carbonation. When Harumi finally lifted the bottle to her lips, the shock of cold sweetness once again startled her, but it no longer frightened her nor confused her. It simply reminded her of how far she had come from those first trembling moments in the jungle clearing. Later that week, lunch brought another surprise, which was field-made hamburgers that were smaller than the first ones and rougher, but still unmistakable. As Harumi unwrapped her portion, she remembered the moment Mercer had handed her that first warm bundle. A memory that once carried terror now brought a quiet, complicated warmth. That evening, as she left the mess hall, Harumi felt a presence nearby. She turned and saw Sergeant Mercer standing a short distance away, speaking with a supply sergeant. His posture was the same, steady and grounded, and his voice carried that familiar calm. When he finished, he glanced toward the women's barracks, and his eyes brushed briefly across Harumi. It was not a stare nor curiosity, but just recognition. And that small human acknowledgement stirred something inside her chest. It was not affection or gratitude, but just the simple realization that this man, not by intention or by design, had become a stable point in the strange new landscape of her life. Over the next days, the women slowly opened up among themselves, sharing memories, whispering fears, and admitting confusion. One woman asked why they were treated this way. No one knew the answer, but Harumi offered the only truth she possessed, saying it was because their rules were different from the stories they heard. A long, heavy silence followed, because they all knew it was true. And it frightened them even more than the alternative, because if the enemy they feared most wasn't the monster, they imagined then everything they believed about this war and everything they believed about themselves had begun to crack. Weeks passed, and the routines at the permanent facility became familiar enough that Harumi no longer startled at every sound or movement. She still missed home and still feared the unknown future, but she no longer lived minute to minute in terror. The Americans treated the women according to regulations, which were firm but consistent and impersonal yet humane. And that alone reshaped everything Harumi thought she knew. Work shifts rotated while health checks continued, and mail, which was heavily censored, was occasionally distributed. Life became a slow, steady rhythm, punctuated by small, unexpected moments, like the rare soft fruit, the cold bottle of soda, or the occasional hamburger that delivered a wave of memory. But the memory no longer frightened her, but instead it humbled her. One afternoon after work detail, Harumi walked along the designated exercise yard, which was a narrow stretch of dirt surrounded by fences. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barracks as birds settled along the wires. She inhaled deeply, feeling the quiet settle around her. Then she saw him. Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood outside the supply office with a clipboard in hand. He was listening to another NCO talk with one boot propped casually on a wooden crate, maintaining the same calm posture and the same unreadable expression. Harumi slowed, not because she expected anything, nor because she wanted anything, but because this man, without knowing it, had become the hinge between her old world and her new one. Had Mercer been cruel that first day, or had he raised his rifle, shouted, or shown contempt, the women's terror would have calcified forever. But he hadn't, and that changed everything. As Harumi stepped past the fence line, Mercer noticed movement and turned slightly. Their eyes met through the gaps in the wire. He gave a simple, almost imperceptible nod. Harumi froze for a breath, then she nodded back, small, respectful, and cautious. There were no words and no smiles, but just an acknowledgement of survival, of shared humanity, and of a moment in the jungle that neither of them would ever forget. Later that night, as Harumi lay on her bed, she stared at the rafters above her. The sounds of the camp drifted through the barracks with distant chatter, boots crunching gravel and the low hum of generators. And she realized something profound. War had taken her freedom, her home, and her certainty, but it had not taken her ability to see truth. She had feared the Americans would take her life, but instead they gave her something she never expected to feel again, which was perspective. It was the understanding that the world was wider, more complicated, and more human than the narrow stories she had been raised on. She closed her eyes, knowing that when the war ended, and she did not know when or how she would leave this camp, carrying memories that defied propaganda. They were memories of fear, yes, but also of steam rising from a metal container, of warm bread, of fizzy sweetness, and of a man lowering his rifle when he didn't have to. These memories proved something simple and unshakable, that even in war, the cruelest and darkest of human inventions, mercy could appear in the most unexpected forms. She remembered a lowered rifle, a warm hamburger, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a nod between enemies who no longer saw each other as monsters. The war had taken much, but it could not take that not from her, and not ever.